Good morning. Today's reading will come to you from Esther 3, verses 8 through 15. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdoms who keep themselves safe. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's law. It is not the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the scripts each province and in the language of each people of all of Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, of the nobles of the various people. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with orders to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on one single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. And a copy of this text of the edict was to be ensured as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was ensured in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered.
David, in the last 3 months, I've had at least 3 times when people have called me Dave. So take that for what it's worth as to who's better looking. If you haven't heard already, the pop culture world was once again rocked by the sudden death of a well-known celebrity earlier this week when it was announced that, oops, red is off. You told me earlier. Yeah. So, of a well-known celebrity earlier this week when it was announced that actor and comedian Robin Williams had committed suicide early Monday morning. In a panel on Fox News that evening, Shepard Smith remarked that Williams took the coward's way out. Understandably, this ignited a firestorm of angry and vitriolic responses through virtually every social medium against both Shepard Smith and Fox News in general, a strange and rare reaction for both of them. Mr. Smith, of course, apologized. What a lot of people don't know is that the coward's way out was a common euphemism up until the last 15 to 20 years in reference to suicide. Those who had taken their own life were often seen as those who were unwilling to face the pressures and responsibilities in front of them. And while I offer no comment on the wisdom or tact of Shepard Smith's words, the hatred that was unleashed upon him in the wake of his comments brings to light an interesting problem. We as a culture are a bit unfamiliar with courage and cowardice. Such vitriol and anger and justification from a distance is evidence that our culture, our society, our world, and maybe even our church is a bit unfamiliar with courage versus cowardice. And perhaps rightly so. After all, courage is something that we rarely hear about today, let alone get a chance to witness. And when we do hear of events attributed to courage or heroism, at least in the media, the act involves nothing of the sort. If this week has been anything, it's been an indication of what our world has come to in the context of what you are allowed to say in the wake of shocking news. Any contrarian opinion is quickly shot down, demeaned and dismissed as cruel, disgusting, and your option of bigoted, racist, stupid, ignorant, or simply hateful. And for example, it seems that every month a news story arises where another celebrity, actor, or professional sports athlete comes out as gay. The accolades are thrown in their direction about how brave, how heroic, and how courageous they are. for doing what so many others have already done. And where any disagreement, let alone opposition to homosexuality or same-sex marriage, leads to accusations of bigotry, or the loss of a job, or the loss of a career, despite what centuries, traditions, or God's Word actually has to say about it. If activist Dan Savage's actions towards Rick Santorum's name are any indication of courage, then it's no wonder that courage is hard to find. I'll let you Google that on your own. And in the midst of this cultural courageous vacuum, in the last 15 years, we've seen a substantial rise in the number of superhero movies. I'm a particular fan of Superman myself, and what is more, the movies have been trending with the need to present an overarching theme of realism. The Christopher Nolan Batman movies and Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, which is about Superman, have led the way. And I think that part of the reason for that increase in superhero movies, in real superhero movies, is because we are searching for real heroes, for real courage. In a world that seems so far from it that celebrities like Robin Williams, Heath Ledger, Michael Jackson, Brittany Murphy, Whitney Houston, and dozens of others in the spotlight have killed themselves, purposely or accidentally, by turning to drugs or suicide or both as a means to deal with their world. Earlier this summer, the world took a small moment to celebrate the 45th anniversary of the moon landing. The fateful and courageous event began with a call from John F. Kennedy in 1962 at Rice Stadium, Houston. And in a mere 7 years, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would hoist a flag and leave shoe prints permanently in the dust on the moon. They ventured there with no guarantee that they would ever come back. They almost ran out of fuel solely on the descent to the moon. Imagine the courage to know that you are still a couple hundred feet from the surface of the moon, and continuing could mean that you would never return home. But they did continue, and they did walk, and they did return. A term I learned this summer when looking into the moon landing is the word apogee. Apogee is the point in orbit when an object is farthest away from the center of the Earth, or rather, it is the highest point of something. When the Apollo missions were soaring through the unknown dimensions of space, the apogees for those capsules, on average, were 267,000 miles farther than any of our current TV satellites and the International Space Station. And why have we not seen this far horizon type of action in our lifetime since 1972, when the program ended? I propose it is because we have gone from apogee to apology. As one political commentator put it, we have gone from looking up to the moon to looking down at Instagram. Rather than looking up, we shuffle our feet and hope it will be over quickly so that we can get on with whatever we were doing before. And no place has reflected this problem of a fallen apogee more than inside the pews of the church. Not since the middle of the Roman Empire has there been such a disdain for righteousness, truth, and justice. And not since the days of Jewish exile in Babylon has there been so few ready to stand up against it. With the constant media against Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A, the media promotion of the repeal of DOMA, it's hard to find a legal friend who can get a job anywhere outside of the religious-based organization or Fox News. Also, since 2007, the number of people in America calling themselves Christians have dropped from 78% to 73%. For you and I, David, that's 5%. I checked on my phone. The areas where those people went were not to other religions, but to the unaffiliated category, which took up 4.3%, comprised of atheists, agnostics, and my personal disdain, nothing in particular. A third were under the age of 30. In 2013, 52% of people said that more people being not religious is either a good thing or it doesn't matter. We have chosen the religion of meh. We are losing our legal battles, we are losing our members, we're losing our children. And I believe it's because we've lost our courage. So how do we find it again? What is interesting is that in the Bible, which was written in Greek, does not contain references to the Greek word for, many references to the Greek word for courage, andrei. Incidentally, this is a source for the name Andrew and Andrea, and so if you got a bun in the oven, this is something to consider. What is more interesting is that the New Testament does not contain the Greek word for courage at all. All of the reference to courage occur in the Old Testament, and depending on your translation, only between 15 and 50 words are translated to courage or bravery throughout the entire Bible. But despite the absence of the word, the presence of the action is evident. And one shining example of courage is found in the story of Queen Esther. This morning, I'd like to look at courage in light of that story, which many of us may already be familiar. And like most stories of courage and heroism, the story of Esther takes on an epic hero journey. I'm going to summarize the story as best as I can. Esther's story begins around 450 BC in the Persian Empire. Persia was relatively new in its development as an empire, with a central city in parts of modern-day Iraq and Iran. In the third year of his reign, King Ahasuerus decided to host a feast, and not just any feast. A half-year-long celebration of the wealth and prosperity of the kingdom. And it was not just any feast, it was a stag party. And the king was showing off. After the half-year demonstration of the greatness of his kingdom, King Ahasuerus throws the citadel and capital city at that time, Susa, a party of its own. Now imagine, if you will, Barack Obama holding a 180-day gala at the White House where he and Michelle bring in the legislatures and governors of all 50 states and the joint chiefs of the 4 branches of the military and the 9 Supreme Court justices and the 435 representatives and the 100 U.S. senators and all the cabinet and all their staff and all their families. And then, following this, good old Barry reaches out to the citizens of Washington, D.C. for a 7-day feast on the White House lawn and wines and dines them to their heart's content. Extravagant, exuberant, excessive. Excuse me. But on the 7th day, the king summons his queen, Vashti, to appear before him in all of her beauty. You can probably infer whatever euphemisms you would like, to be showcased before his generals. But Vashti refuses. We don't know why, but we do know that the king is outraged. And he's so angry and embarrassed that he, upon the advice of his close advisors, choose to banish her from the kingdom. And in this story, we learn that when the king issues a law, it may not be repealed, and the hope for the queen is gone. What is not revealed in the story, but we can infer from many historical accounts, is that soon after this, King Ahasuerus launches a massive military campaign against Sparta. You may know this king by his other name, Xerxes. If you've seen the movie 300, which is where this is from, that's this guy. Pompous, short-tempered, kind of frightening. Looks like a Christmas ornament. Later, the king remembers his actions towards Vashti, and again, upon the advice of his counselors, he holds tryouts, a beauty contest made out of a new harem. Now, for you teenagers who stopped paying attention like 8-10 minutes ago, a harem is a group of wives and sex slaves for the king. Harem literally means forbidden place because it's just a house for women to get ready to go and be pleasing to the king. And the only male allowed in had to be a eunuch. To give an idea of what it's like, imagine the show The Bachelor mixed in with Big Brother, and you have an idea of what's going on. And as part of this whole ordeal, the contestants have a year-long training program of perfume and makeup management and Pilates and bubblegum and stickers or whatever they do, and choice of items to be pleasing to the king. Well, enter the hero. The most beautiful maidens of the Persian Empire were brought to the palace. Imagine Kate Upton, Rachel McAdams, Sandra Bullock, Kerry Washington, Mila Kunis, and Scarlett Johansson, all in one room. Not for too long. One of these maidens was Esther, a Jewish orphan raised by her older cousin Mordecai. Now I imagine Mordecai to look a little bit like Obi-Wan Kenobi. You too must learn the ways of the concubines. Mordecai convinced Esther never to reveal her identity as one of the Jewish minority who lived in Persia since the exile from Jerusalem. Mordecai cared for her and would even come to the door of the harem each day to make sure that she was all right. Yet Esther impressed all who met her, including the eunuch who watched the harem, giving her a position of management over the others. And when it came time to go before the king for her one shot at impressing him, she had the wisdom to ask for the eunuch's advice. And thus Esther impressed the king, who chose her to be his queen. Because Mordecai is looking in on Esther, he happens to hear of a plot to assassinate the king during one of his trips to check in on her. Mordecai immediately tells Esther, who reports it to the king in Mordecai's name. The plot was true, and the conspirators were hanged. And the event was recorded in the daily briefings of the Chronicles of the King. The king then promotes a guy named Haman, a descendant of Amalek, the traditional enemy of the Jews, to the position of basically chief advisor. Haman was a wicked and vain man who expected everyone to bow down to him. I imagine Darth Vader or Kevin Spacey when I think of Haman. And when he is walking in the palace courtyard, he notices that Mordecai does not bow down to him, which sets Haman off. And so Haman decides to kill the people of Mordecai, the Jews. He does this by casting lots. In the language of the day, it was called pure, which means to cast lots. Now, the term casting lots is a term that is used frequently throughout the Bible. We usually don't really know what it means. We think it may be rolling of the dice. Traditionally, it was a means of determining the will of God in the absence of the Holy Spirit. The lots would be some representation of a yes or a no, or a name, or of a property ownership. It took the form of a set of different colored marked stones, bones, or sticks, and gathered into a small bag the size of a large hacky sack, and expunged through a small tube that could only fit one of the stones at a time. And the first pebble or die or stick that came out was deemed the will of God. And so that leads us to the scripture this morning and our main problem. There we go. Through deception, Haman persuades King Ahasuerus to go along with his plans to kill the Jews, and with the king's permission, Haman issues an edict proclaiming the 13th and 14th of the month of Adar for the genocide. Then, the ultimate Facebook Messenger conversation happens between Mordecai and Esther through Esther's eunuch. Mordecai learns what was done. There's great mourning among the Jews, including Mordecai, who is devastated and ripping his clothes. Queen Esther, deeply distressed at Mordecai's condition, asks, and she calls for an explanation. Mordecai explains the decree and the commands, and commands Esther to go to the king to beg his favor and to plead with him on behalf of her people. And these are probably the most famous lines from this story. Esther then replies to Mordecai, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside of the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. Mordecai sends a reply to Esther. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape more than any of all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And Esther is faced with the ultimate decision. The beauty queen, the successful and beloved queen of Persia, now must risk revealing her only secret for the sake of possibly saving others. It's like Superman here. And Esther must choose. Perhaps Mordecai is crazy and she could live in secret. And perhaps not. And so she chooses. Her reply, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther summoned her courage and entered the king's inner court dressed in her most royal garb. The king granted her an audience and promised her virtually anything that she asked. Esther replied that she wished to invite the king and Haman to a banquet the next day. And at the feast, she asked her guests to return for a banquet the following day. Haman left the first banquet consumed with self-importance and pride. Haman thinks that the good things are going for him. Those feelings then turned to rage when he saw Mordecai, who paid Haman no attention. So Haman has a gallows made to hang Mordecai from it. The king that night cannot sleep. He has the daily journal read to him, and he realizes that he forgot to thank Mordecai for saving his life earlier. And at the second banquet, Esther finally, through her fears, reveals Haman's plot, reveals that she is a Jew herself, and begs for the king to spare the life of her and her people. The king storms off, and when he returns, Haman is grabbing a hold of the queen, begging for his own life. The king has Haman hung on the gallows he made for Mordecai, and Mordecai is given Haman's position. And although the law could not be changed, the king allows Mordecai to issue a new edict, allowing the Jews to defend themselves. And on the 13th and 14th days of the month of Adar, the Jews were victorious against their enemies, and remember the days in celebration of Purim, a celebration marking Esther's courage. This is a very powerful story, but it really doesn't tie to us that naturally. Let's think back. When was the last time that you were the leader of the king's harem, when you stopped the annihilation of the Jewish people and someone marked a holiday in your honor till the end of time? Probably not that recently. I can bet that doesn't apply to us that often. But the story of Esther can speak to us because we can see how we too can become courageous through her actions. And the first way that we do that is through the courage to prepare. Preparation involves petitioning the powerful. Dad, you're going to like this, by the way. It's alliteration. It's the perfect power of the presenter. So, Esther's first commands the Jews in the city to hold a fast. But Esther does not leave it up only to them. She says, "We will fast." Esther begins her preparation not by setting up battle plans or by coming up with a banquet theme, but by adhering to the tradition of fasting. No food, no drink. In Iraq for 3 days. It's an all-in beseeching to God. While no mention of prayer is included, there's a strong inference that prayer was involved. Otherwise, what are you going to do for 3 days when you're not eating? Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Colossians 4:2 and 3, "Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it, in thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison." Even Jesus' words at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, saying, "When you pray and when you fast," are buttressed by illustrations of giving to the needy and laying up treasures in heaven, not being anxious. There's a strong implication for you and I that when we have a need, when our end goals are in view, when we are prone to worry, we should be praying and fasting. How much more courage would we have if we took the time to speak to God about our problems before we had to make a decision? Preparation also means reaching out to your peers. Esther's example: "Gather all the Jews in Susa and fast on my behalf. I and my young women will also." There wasn't the elders will do that, or who's in charge of this at the moment? No, she joins them. This is an all-in moment, and she is all in. Scripture shows other examples like this. Jesus, the night that he was betrayed, while he himself prayed in the garden, asked his disciples to pray. When Peter and James in Acts 12 were in prison, James is killed, and the church springs into action with earnest prayer on Peter's behalf, prompting an angel to intercede and break Peter out of his imprisonment. Moses had Hur and Aaron to hold up his hands while the Israelites fought none other than Amalek in Exodus 17. Remember, Amalek is the patriarch of Haman in our story. The point being, how much more could we accomplish if we knew that our brothers and sisters were there watching our sides, carrying part of the load with us? When I pledged a fraternity at Abilene, we had a ceremony on the first night. We were given 2 bricks to hold to our sides. And when it was obvious that our arms were tired, our mentor and our older brother in the fraternity would come up and hold our arms for us. There is nothing like knowing that someone is there to hold up your arms with you. But eventually, preparation involves a plan. Esther did more than just some guesses at what could work. She already had a leg up because she had done her homework as to what would work. She was aware. In Proverbs 19, it says, "Desire without knowledge is not good, and whoever makes haste with his feet misses the way." Esther had to learn the dynamics of the harem and the ways to please the king. More than that, she had to learn how to manage others when it was proper to approach the king, what the king liked to eat. She learned how to prepare a feast for a king. This was like a catering business, not just a dinner at home one night. Esther had to become the best, and she was the best. It was more than obvious that much of Esther's success was begun by first impressing the eunuch, giving her a management position, then again seeking his counsel before seeing the king. Before she was called to do something on the grand scale, Esther had to demonstrate her ability to master the small steps along the way. She had to master how to be dressed royally, how to approach the king. She had to master how to throw a royal banquet. She had to do the work, but did it better than her peers. She sought out how to do it better, and she started with the small things. What small things have you bested? In his book, The Cardinal Virtues, William DeWitt Hyde explains, "The man who cannot reduce to order the things that are lying passively around him and endure the petty pains incidental to doing hard things before the sheer lapse of time forces him into action is not the man who will be calm and composed when angry mobs are howling about him, or who will go steadily on his way when greed and corruption, hypocrisy and hate are arrayed to resist him." If we are to be effective believers when the time comes for us to be courageous, we must be able to start showing bravery in the small things first. Perhaps this means simply showing up to church on time or offering to help on Sunday morning. Perhaps it means stepping out of your comfort zone and offering to help with a Sunday morning class. Perhaps it means saying no to other things during the week so you can prepare for Sunday morning class. And that's no comment to what I have seen today at all, just to make sure. Perhaps it means that you show your kids that what happens on Sunday morning needs to happen every other day of the week as well. Maybe it means putting down the remote. Maybe it means showing up. You can tell a lot about what a person cares about by what they show up for. But Esther was also patient. She doesn't simply rush into the palace haphazardly. She waits for the opportune moment to make her request. Aristotle, in his Eudemian Ethics, define courage as the means between fear and recklessness. Reckless people take unnecessary risks with excessive confidence in the face of danger. Courageous people, on the other hand, fear what should be feared, but endure the fear with confidence for the right reason. Like Esther, we need not jump into danger just because it may need to be done, but because the effective risk has presented itself. Sometimes we just need to wait for it like a surfer riding a wave. There's an old adage that luck favors the prepared. And taking the time to be aware of what's going on around us, to master what we are doing, and be patient for the moment when we can most effectively use our talents, after we've asked for advice and assistance, then we can expect God to reveal himself and his desires for us in this moment, as we have asked him to from the start. Esther would never have had the king to dinner without preparation. She also needs to have the courage to perform. Eventually, we have to produce. We ultimately have to act. We have to jump off the diving board, step out on stage, choose your illustration. Esther had done all of her prep work. She set up the dinner, she set up the moment. Even here, we see a bit of hesitation. She doesn't ask for it right away. Eventually, though, she did have to ask the question. Dr. Philip Zimbardo, back in 1971, conducted the Stanford Prison Experiment. And in the experiment, 24 students in college were asked to act as prison guards in a mock prison. What was interesting about the experiment was that the good people tended to turn into sadistic tyrants when placed in a position of authority over other human beings. But even more interesting was that there were still good guards that existed in the prison. These guards did not abuse or insult the student prisoners like the evil guards did, but they never tried to stop the abuse either. Thus, the good guards actually ended up facilitating the abuse by not taking action. In the legal field, this is called nonfeasance. If we are to be believers that Jesus calls us to be in this world, to be the salt and the light, eventually we have to act. If Esther chickened out at the last minute, all of her work would have been for nothing. We also must persist. Notice that Esther, once she asked for the intercession of her people once, she has less hesitation to ask again in chapter 8:3. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman. And again in chapter 9, verses 12 and 13, she again approaches the king. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and Haman's 10 sons will be impaled on poles. And yes, I'll admit, I just wanted to say they'll be impaled on poles. That just sounds awesome. Her ability to endure the fear and possible consequences of failure lessened the more she acted courageously. And wouldn't that be applicable to us? Isn't it easier to deal with the pain the more that we have it? In his 1902 book, The Cardinal Virtues, William DeWitt Hyde explains, the wide and permanent ends at which justice and wisdom often involve what is in itself, and for the present, disagreeable and painful. The acquisition of a competence involves hard work when nature calls for rest. The solution of a problem requires for us to be wide awake when nature urges sleep. The advocacy of a reform involves unpopularity when nature suggests the advantages of having the good opinion of our fellows. The life of the country calls for the death of the soldier when nature bids him to cling to life by running away. But wisdom and justice, however, see the present and partial pain as part of a wider personal and social good in order that the pain be endured. True courage, therefore, is simply the executor of the orders of wisdom and justice. The wise and just man who knows what he wants and is bound to get it at all costs is the only man who can truly be brave. For the strength of one's courage is simply the strength of the wise and just aims to which he holds. Recently, my son Henry collected a caterpillar in my father-in-law's garden. And on a whim, we decided to keep it in a small container with some leaves for food and a stick to crawl on. And as hoped for, we watched it form a cocoon or a chrysalis. Where's my wife? Because she always corrects me on that. She's not here, so that really fell flat. And while this was going on, we were hoping that it would turn into a butterfly. My brother David told me something that he heard about butterflies, that when they are ready to emerge from within the cocoon, their ability to survive depends on their ability to emerge without assistance. The study that he had read had found that the butterflies who received help getting out of the cocoons did not have the strength to survive for more than a few moments upon re-entering the world. Well-meaning researchers relieving the butterflies of pain ended up killing them because they did not know that the pain is what gave them their strength. Lastly, we have personal pride. This is not the bad kind, not haughtiness, but a sense of honor. Esther was presented with two options. She would die or she might die. Yet her courage was secured when her mentor, Mordecai, reminded her that a greater honor might be at risk, the risk to her honor. One of my personal heroes is a man who has been dead for about 200 years. Part of the reason why I became interested in law school again was from reading a book about John Adams by David McCullough. What amazed me about him from the get-go was that John Adams, one of the founders of our country, defended the British soldiers when they were tried for their actions for the Boston Massacre. During his closing argument, Adams said, "If I can be but the instrument of preserving one life, his blessings and tears shall be sufficient consolation for me for the contempt of mankind." For Adams, it was more of a sense of personal honor that he felt he must defend the soldiers who were involved in killing his own neighbors. But Adams did not have so much of a regard for others when he took part in drafting the oldest written constitution years later, the Constitution of Massachusetts. There he said, "It's not true that any people ever existed who loved the public better than themselves." John F. Kennedy, in his book Profiles in Courage, responded to this quote, saying, on the contrary, it was precisely because they did love themselves, because each one's need to maintain his own respect for himself was more important to him than his popularity with the other. Because his desire to maintain his office, of his conscience, his personal standard of ethics, his integrity, his morality, call it what you will, was stronger than the pressures of public disapproval. Because his faith that his courage was the best one, and would ultimately be vindicated outweighed his fear of public reprisal. We must also promote. We must pass the praise, not the buck. In Esther, Mordecai ends up being promoted to Haman's position. And while Esther receives all of Haman's possessions, she's still in charge of the harem. Esther's not mentioned in the annals of Persian history. And for a time, she was hardly mentioned in Jewish history, until only around the time of Jesus was her presence even recognized. Harry Truman is quoted as saying, "It's amazing what you can accomplish when you do not care who gets the credit." Esther's request leads Mordecai to becoming the number 2 man in the kingdom. And who wouldn't blame Esther for have taken the credit? After all, she risked her neck for the whole nation. But Esther knew, and so should we, that the reasons we are given the talents and gifts and circumstances that we have are not for our story to be told, but for God's story to be told. At the end of the story of Esther, the days that were originally marked to destroy the Jews because of Haman's cast of the lot turned into a celebration named for the same act, Purim. And there's a great analogy there. What began as a nightmare of chance became the purposes of joy. What seemed random turned out to be quite planned. What seemed to be a moment of fear and death became, through courage, a moment of hope. Lastly, we must have the courage to pursue. We need to have the courage to pursue further opportunities to be courageous. Esther's journey did not stop with the first request of the king, and neither will our journey. Yet the person I find most fascinating in this story is not Esther, but Mordecai. Mordecai was the one who took the role of a single father to his orphaned cousin. Mordecai entered the king's court each day to check on his adopted daughter. Mordecai was the one who first warned of the king's imminent danger. Mordecai stood up to the tyrant Haman when all else bowed down to him. Mordecai learned of the plot to kill the Jews and commanded an official of the king to give a message to the queen, even though any other context that would have raised eyebrows as to the relationship with the queen. Mordecai wrote the battle plan to save the Jews, and Mordecai set the date to the new festival. What amazing things we can do when we understand that our example may inspire the courage of others. Behind me, I told you before, I'm a big Superman fan. Not many people know that Superman was not originally created to fly or to fight world-ending types of consequences. This is the first issue of Action Comics displayed above, which shows Superman the first time ever, doing simple things one after another, fighting corruption in politics, ensuring the innocent are not wrongly treated or accused, and even stopping domestic violence. Originally, the point of the alter ego of Clark Kent was to avoid exposure as Superman so that the good could be done without everyone just relying on Superman alone. While if I heard or saw a number of Christians about to be slaughtered, I might be more aware, it would be easy to think that when I was finished, as soon as the circumstances I was in calmed. But we don't live in a comic book. Our lives are continuous, and as Jesus has told us, there will always be the poor, the sick, the wrongfully accused, the sinful, the deeply disturbed, the broken, and the hurting. And as our call as Christians begins with asking whether we are willing to give all for the sake of the call, courageously tackling these problems daily. Many of you may have heard of Dr. Kent Brantley. I meant to have a picture of him up here. Kent Brantley has become a world-famous individual. I can proudly say that I kind of know him. Dr. Brantley was in my fraternity at Abilene. He gave up the opportunities of wealth and prestige that being a doctor in America can bring and decided to help the people of Liberia with the worst Ebola outbreak on record. He and 2 others contracted Ebola while helping out. It's a terrible, terrible disease. And a friend of mine put it best about him when the things were looking dire a few weeks ago. And here's an excerpt of what he wrote about the situation. "I don't want Kent to die because the world needs people who look and live like Jesus. The world needs people who see disease, risk, and danger as invitations for going instead of excuses for avoiding. I don't want Kent to die because if he does, that's one less person living out the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus in real time, in real life. Not somebody talking about it from a pulpit, reading about it in a coffee shop. Kent strikes me as a guy who believes that the Word became flesh, and so he has done likewise. I don't want Kent to die because we need people who are living now like Jesus, without much concern for the proper view or theology or clearly spelled out explanations of hell and how one arrives there. Some of those things are important, but only if they get you off the couch and into a world full of hurt. We need people who aren't satisfied with safe, comfortable theology that gives them the permission to lead a safe and comfortable life. We need people who are willing to stand toe-to-toe with death and pain and disease and brokenness because their love for life is so fierce. I've said many times that there's always a reason you shouldn't make sacrifices for others. It will never be the right time. It will always cost you something, and you'll be forced to sacrifice something precious to you. There's always a reason not to move your family to Liberia. There's always a reason to stay on the road that's broad, avoiding the one that's narrow. But the world moves nowhere when we're only concerned with ourselves. The world only gets better when I sacrifice what matters to me so that I might do what matters to us. The world gets better when the church decides that the word only matters when it takes on flesh. I don't know if the world will ever reach for the moon or Mars or any other celestial object again in my time. But I can tell you that believers like Kent Brantley come further to reaching the apogee of Jesus than anyone I know. Let us all be willing to seek that higher point. And why wouldn't we? We're believers. The story of Esther is a story of choices and key moments. Her choice saved a nation and carries influences into our culture today. I should let you know that the name Esther translates to star. And so does it with her Jewish name, Hadassah. As for the Hollywood star, Robin Williams, we don't know what he believed or where he placed his faith. And the selfish part of me wants to believe that I will see Robin Williams in heaven again one day. But that's a decision I can safely leave in the hands of the Father. And while we cannot know now what his outcome might be, we can secure our own. Perhaps this morning the courage you seek is simply the courage to take the 8 steps from your seat to the front row. Perhaps it is simply the courage to ask for prayer and fasting on your behalf for some future act of courage. Perhaps it is the courage to admit that you were wrong. Perhaps it is the courage to admit that you need help. Perhaps the courage you seek is the courage to begin anew by placing your life in the hands of Jesus. It takes courage to journey into the unfamiliar and the unknown. But the first step always makes the next just a little bit more familiar. Won't you be courageous this morning as we stand and as we sing?